Hey, I'm Lorelei. I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist with Near North Health, and it is National Homemade Soup Day. So today I wanted to take you through a little demonstration showing you how you too can make your own homemade soup. National Homemade Soup Day couldn't have come at a better time. It is cold here in Chicago. We're having winter storms and snow. So best thing to do, cook yourself up a pot of something warm and delicious and stay home and enjoy it if you can. I feel like there are two kinds of people when it comes to home cooking, whether you're making soup or pretty much anything else. There's the kind of person who wants to get a recipe and follow it exactly. And then there's the kind of person who sort of pulls together whatever they can find in their kitchen and just makes something out of their own imagination from scratch. I tend to be a little bit more of the second type. I really like to just pull together ingredients that I have around and try to create something that tastes delicious. The results vary, I have to admit, but sometimes when you follow a recipe, it doesn't turn out well either, or very often you'll find that you want to try a recipe, but you're missing one or two ingredients, and so you don't even bother trying to make it. I think maybe the best of both worlds is sort of a hybrid where you use a recipe as like a template and then feel free to adjust or change things up a little bit based on your personal preference, based on what you have on hand or what's easily available to you at your grocery store if you do make a shopping trip. And then also you could taste as you go and maybe adjust seasonings accordingly as you continue to follow the recipe. Today what I wanted to do was just kind of lay out a basic formula for making soup that you can follow, so you could do this without a recipe if you wanted to. I'm actually using some ingredients that were in the produce box that some of you may have picked up from the North and Costner Near North Health site this week, because I thought it was a good idea to show you some ways you can use ingredients, even if they weren't things that you intentionally went out to buy. Soup is a great place to put vegetables, produce, things like potatoes and greens that maybe you didn't have another use for other than maybe just, cooking it and eating it plain. So today I'm going to show you kind of how you can work with what you've got to make a hopefully delicious soup. So to start a soup, the first thing you kind of want to do is start with what they call aromatics, which would be a base of things like onions. You can saute those in olive oil. Traditional, you would use like a mirepoix combination, which is onion, celery, and carrots, but different cultures have different versions of that. So some start with things like peppers or garlic or even tomatoes as the starting point for a soup. So today I've got onions. I'm going to be using onions. I'm going to saute these in some olive oil. And then, because I don't have celery or carrots, I'm going to use what I have. This soup is going to include kale and potatoes and red pepper in addition to the onions. What I'm going to use in the very, very beginning step is the chopped kale stems. So the leaves are going to cook really quickly. We're going to put the kale leaves in at the end. But these stems are much tougher. Sometimes we just kind of throw these away. But if you cook them early, they're going to soften up. And why waste good food if you've got it available? Have a big pan. I maybe don't need one quite this big, but this is what I got. So this is what I'm using. And you can put it on high-ish to heat it up, but eventually we're going to turn it down to a lower temperature. And then I'm going to add some olive oil. Again, if you're following a recipe, you might be inclined to measure. I rarely measure. I use probably about a tablespoon as you pour into your pan. A tablespoon, I would say, spreads out to about the size of a frozen waffle. That's sort of my rough way to estimate about how much I'm going to put in. But it doesn't need to be exact. This is mostly just to help keep things from sticking to the bottom of the pan as you saute them. After that heats up, I'm going to add in the onion, and then I'm going to probably let the onion cook for a bit first before I add even any other ingredients at all. I do think onions really make a difference in soups because they add a lot of flavor. If you don't like onions or if you have an allergy or something like that, you might need to skip those onions, but then just know you're going to need to find other ways to build flavor throughout the recipe. I happen to have red onion. That's what I'm using. You could use yellow onion, you could use white onion, whatever kind you've got, it's okay. So if your recipe calls for a yellow onion and you just happen to have a white onion in your house, use that. Don't feel like you have to run out to the store and buy something different. Is the flavor slightly different between onions? Sure, but it's gonna end up okay regardless. So I'm just gonna get this in now that that oil's heated up just a little bit. And you can let the onions cook for a few minutes, and sometimes until they're wilted, until they're browned. If this was the only thing I was using as my base, I would probably let them go 5 or 10 minutes, but because I'm gonna add in these little kale stems as well in the beginning, I can probably add those in after just a couple minutes after the onions have just wilted. Stir these up. Now, one of the things I love about soups is they are a great way to make use of ingredients that you have around, particularly vegetables. If you have vegetables that are a little past their prime, that maybe are getting a little soggy, a little wilty, a wilted vegetable is still usable. For example, I've got some Swiss chard here, and I was actually able to revive some of this Swiss chard by putting the stems in water. I actually have a reel on Instagram about how you can revive leafy green vegetables if you want to, so check that reel out. But like some of these are still really wilty, and frankly, for something like soup, it's okay to use a wilted vegetable because it's gonna soften up when you cook it anyways. These leaves are gonna go in at the end, but I am gonna now also separate the leaves from the stems and chop up the stems to go in at the beginning. These are chard stems, are almost similar to celery. They're probably not quite as crispy and crunchy, but they have a similar texture to something like celery. So I thought these would be appropriate to put in the beginning, where sometimes you would do something like celery and carrots. By the way, my reference recipe called for kale. I am using some kale, but I also thought, oh, well, I'll use some Swiss chard too, because I have that. So one leafy green can usually be substituted for another leafy green. Similar to most vegetables in a recipe, if you have a recipe that calls for zucchini, but you don't have zucchini, but you have a pepper, you might be able to substitute that. So I think you can use your own judgment as to whether one kind of vegetable will sub for another, but I think that those things are usually interchangeable. I'm also a fan of adding more vegetables where you can. So maybe you have plenty of vegetables to follow your recipe, but you also have just like a little chunk of broccoli that you don't know what you're gonna do with it. Just put it in your soup, why not? It's gonna absorb flavor, it's gonna just make the soup a little bit bigger to stretch it a little further. So these onions are nice and steamy, let's just say. They're starting to cook up. I'm gonna turn the heat down a little bit because my pan is definitely hot at this point. Add in the kale stems. And I'm just gonna set the kale to the side, and I'm gonna set the chard leaves to the side, because those are gonna get added later step because they cook quickly. But these stems can go in at this point. Okay. I've got one of these fun, flexible cutting boards, so I can just kind of pour and fold it up and dump them in. You can definitely smell the onion, thus it is an aromatic because it has a great aroma. I'm not gonna add meat to this dish, but this would actually be the point if you were gonna add like chicken or ground beef or something to your soup, that you would want to brown that in with the aromatics. So that would be the next stage of your soup if you wanted to add something like that. This is gonna be a vegetarian soup, so I'm not gonna do that step, but the next thing I'm gonna wanna add are heartier vegetables. So I have, like I said, potatoes and red pepper, so those are gonna go in next. They're not gonna cook completely, they're gonna ultimately cook once we put the liquid into the soup, but we just kind of want to get them a little bit started. And when we add these in, you can also add in something like salt, and that helps to bring out some of the moisture in the vegetables so they cook a little bit quicker, and it just brings out flavors as well. Red pepper. This is also, I think, going to be a really pretty soup because of the red pepper and the green kale. It should be brightly colored. And then potatoes. Kale and potato soup is kind of almost a classic, so those are really nice things to put together. I also thought these are really easy to find ingredients that aren't expensive. Soup can be so affordable, so it doesn't have to include anything real fancy. And then I'm going to add some salt. Salt as you go, you can always add more. It's much harder to add less. So I'm just going to do a little bit to start, just a few shakes. I'm not really measuring. It's up to you whether you want to go that route or not. All right, so these are going to cook for a few minutes also, but then before you add the liquid, we're going to add in dried seasonings, things like spices or herbs. If you're using fresh herbs like fresh basil or cilantro or parsley, those would want to go in at the end because those just cook in a flash. But anything dried, those flavors need time to develop, and they actually develop a little bit better in the pan with the vegetables than if you just put them in with the water and have them boil away in there. When I add in the liquid, this is a step later, I do not have broth or stock. I'm just going to use water. So I'm thinking ahead, okay, well, I don't have that broth, which would add some flavor. So I need to make sure I'm getting a lot of flavor through herbs and also a little bit of salt as well. But so I've got to find ways to build the flavor so that if all I'm adding is water as a liquid, I'm still going to end up with a really tasty soup. I'm going to use, starting with garlic powder. Now, if you had fresh garlic, you could have added that in with some of these aromatics or the harder vegetables, but I don't have fresh garlic, so I'm going to use some garlic powder, and I think this is going to really brighten things up. Just a note, fresh garlic, you could add several cloves, but garlic powder is more concentrated, so do not add the same volume of garlic powder as you would add of fresh garlic. And do probably just like a half a teaspoon, so it doesn't need to be that much. Another tip, I make this mistake all the time, but I was told by someone, a friend of mine I know who works at a spice company, that you should not shake your spice containers right over a hot pot because the steam from the pot can actually get into your spice jars and cause them to kind of cake up. So try to pour your spices into measuring things away from your pot as opposed to just shaking them right over the pot. So we're going to add a little of that. I think there's a lot of options you have in terms of flavoring or spicing any soup. Not everything mixes perfectly together. So I think when you're imagining your spice palette, you kind of got to think about, well, what are my main ingredients and how are those going to go well? Potatoes and rosemary, like that's kind of a classic combination. So I'm like, oh, well, what else goes with rosemary? Things like oregano and thyme. This is all a little bit like Italian seasonings. These go together. So you might want to think about what goes together and then combine, or you could just use a single spice if you're worried about it, or a single spice or an herb. P.S. Do you know the difference between a spice and an herb? An herb comes from the leaf of a plant, and spices come from other parts of the plant, such as seeds, or the bark, or the stem, or the root. If you were using fresh, you would use more. If you're using dry, you use less. But you want to make sure that you're building enough flavor. If I was making like a chili where you want a ton of flavor, I would probably put in about 3 tablespoons total of spices or herbs. I'm probably not going to need quite that much. I'm going to probably put in a teaspoon at least of each of these. These are harder to add later on because they just don't build into the dish as well if you add these at the end. That said, if you don't have a lot of spices on hand, you can season a soup with just things like salt and pepper. You'll get the flavors of the vegetables, and as long as there's a little brightness there, you can do that as well. Oh, I'm measuring over the pot. Bad. Don't do that. Don't do it. And when you put the herbs in at this stage, you can smell them, and that's kind of what you want. You want them to get to the point where you can kind of smell the flavors of the herbs. So we're doing kind of blooming them. So other things that you might want to add to this before adding your liquid would be things like tomato paste. I'm not going to use tomato paste today, but I do have canned tomatoes, and I'm going to add this with the liquids. If you're adding fresh tomatoes, however, you could do that at the end, like even as a topping, just because those don't take a lot of time to cook. Wow, this is a terrible can opener. I'm also going to throw a bay leaf in with the liquid because that is also going to add just more flavoring, and it's going to help while everything simmers, enhance flavors in general. You could add 1 or 2 if you think it goes with the flavors of the rest of your dish. Add in some tomatoes. Don't strain these. Use all the juice in there. And then the amount of water you add, I would say, is a little bit up to personal choice. So a lot of recipes will call for things like 4 cups or 8 cups. If you're cooking something that's going to absorb liquid, like beans or lentils or pasta, then obviously you need more liquid because a lot of it's going to get absorbed. The potatoes are going to cook in the liquid, but they're not really going to absorb the liquid. So I want to make sure I've got enough liquid to cover so that they actually have a chance to boil and cook in there. But I don't think my liquid's going to be absorbed as they cook. I'm going to pour some of this into this can and just make sure I get all of the stuff out of there. I generally say taste as you go, but something like this is a little hard to taste in the early stages because you don't really have a sense of any flavors having developed yet. To get this to cook faster, or I wouldn't say cook faster, to heat up faster to boiling, you can put the lid on it. That just traps the heat a little better. And then you want it to come up to a boil, and then once it's come to a boil, you can lower it to a simmer. And then you really are just going to keep it on there until the harder vegetables have cooked. So I want the potatoes to be soft. Things that you might have in there that really need to soften are things like carrots, or if you're using something like turnips or any kind of root vegetable, those take a little longer to cook, sweet potatoes, things like that. So make sure those are cooked. And then we move on to adding the later ingredients. In my case, the later ingredients are going to include things like kale and the chard leaves that I have set aside. I'm also going to add canned beans to this dish. Because these are already cooked, I don't need to add them now. I just have a can of beans. These are cannellini beans, which are a white bean, and I thought these would blend well with this dish. You could use a different kind of bean. You could use 2 cans of beans if you want a little bit more. This is going to add just a little bit of protein, so it's not a strictly vegetable soup, but it's optional or versatile, let's just say. This kale and the chard, we could just tear up the leaves. You could cut it into ribbons. They're going to shrink down. So break them up into the size that you would like them to be, knowing that they will shrink from there. This is super wilted, but I'm going to throw it in there anyways, because what difference does it make? It's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with it other than you wouldn't want it in a salad, but it'll be fine in the soup. So once my base ingredients have had a chance to simmer for a while in the liquid and they're starting to get cooked, I'm actually going to taste this broth really quick and just see if it needs anything for sure. So it's going to be hot. Be careful as you taste, but it can give you some information. Okay. So it's got some flavor to it, but I think it's going to need more salt. And I was planning to add more salt anyways as I add these greens and the beans. Things like potatoes absorb a lot of salt. Anything starchy needs a little extra salt. And then of course, the more vegetables you add, the more you need to season accordingly. So I'm going to go ahead and add in these greens. Now the kale could probably go in pretty early because it is a little hardier than the Swiss chard, but I'm going to just put them all in there together. And I'm going to toss in my beans. Probably could use 2 cans. These beans aren't going to go very far, but that's okay. And then I'm going to add about a teaspoon of salt. That's maybe a little heavy teaspoon. We'll let it work. And stir again, some more. Like I said, the greens are going to wilt pretty quickly. And as the greens wilt, they may also give off some of their liquid, so it will bulk up the liquid of the soup as well. At some point before, maybe shortly before finished cooking time, so maybe about 15 minutes ahead, I think it can be really beneficial to add an acid, such as a vinegar or a wine vinegar, or even like a lemon juice, something like that. So I've got red wine vinegar, and I'm going to add 2 tablespoons to about 1/4 cup. It's going to add so much brightness to your soup. You do want it to cook a little bit, but not a lot. So I'm going to add that after these have all had a chance to wilt down just a little bit. So now I'm going to add a little bit of this vinegar. Don't skip this step. Even if you only have like white vinegar, it really is going to enhance the flavor of your food if you put in a little bit of this acid at the end. Towards the end. And then this is gonna cook for probably another 10-15 minutes. At the end, you'll want to take out the bay leaf. The final step would be adding things to like top your soup. So that could be like fresh tomatoes or fresh parsley, or even like top it with like seeds or something like that. Some people will do that with soup. But we're going to let this cook for a few more minutes. So soup, it's not fast, but it's not hard. You do not need to be an expert to be a great soup maker. Soup is pretty forgiving, but it does take a little bit of time. You want it to simmer so the flavors can develop. And as we talked about here, you can build this really in layers. So just to kind of review, first layer would be aromatics, things like onion, maybe celery, carrots, or anything that's like real hard but it's going to cook up at the very beginning. And then the next would be harder vegetables. Peppers, zucchini, mushrooms, potatoes would go in there. Anything that needs to spend some time cooking in some liquid to get softer. And then you would add your seasonings, things like herbs, tomato paste, spices. And then you want to add the liquid so that everything can simmer together. And then later, near the end, you would add softer vegetables that don't need much cooking time, things like leafy greens or fresh herbs. And then maybe an acid or something there. The other thing that you would add at that stage is things that are already cooked, such as cooked beans or cooked rice, if those are added to your dish. If you were going to do something where you had like pasta or something you were cooking in your soup, you would add that at about the same time that you added the liquids. And that would be something that could just cook in the soup. And then finally, after your soup is completely done, if there's anything you want to top it with, you can go ahead and do that. Soup is actually usually great next day as well, because even if you put that soup in the fridge, the flavors will continue to develop, and reheated soup is delicious. Most soups can be frozen and saved for later. So making a big batch of soup at the beginning of a week, even if you don't think you can get through it in that week, put a little bit of it aside in the freezer, and then you've got that to reheat for the next week, and it'll be just kind of nice, something you don't have to make. So I hope you found something interesting in this. As I said, this one is a little bit of an experiment, so I'm not entirely positive how it's going to turn out. But if you taste as you go, you can adjust. So if I find that I'm at the end of this soup and it's like, it just needs some pepper, you can add some pepper or a little bit more salt. Or if I didn't add enough of that acid, I might be like, this needs to be brightened up just a little bit. The other thing you can do is just make notes so that if you know you did something one time and it worked real well, remember it for next time. Or if something didn't go so well together, like you had an odd combination of flavors, or maybe you added too much of one thing, not enough of another, you can make some notes for yourself, whether it's written down like a recipe or just mental notes, so that you can get really good at this sort of thing over time with a little bit of practice. So many people who make soups, they just make it by memory and you never need a recipe at all. But I know it can take a little trial and error to get to that stage. Once your soup is done, if you've got something in there like a bay leaf, well, take that out and then you can dish it up into a mug or a bowl and enjoy. Happy National Homemade Soup Day from us here at Near North Health.